The U.S. involvement in Afghanistan became one of the longest and most costly wars in American history, spanning over 20 years. What began as a mission to eliminate al-Qaeda after 9/11 turned into a prolonged nation-building effort that collapsed in August 2021, leaving Afghanistan in the hands of the Taliban once again. Here's how it all unraveled. Before the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001, it had already played a key role in shaping the country's future during the Cold War. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support its communist-aligned government. The U.S., viewing this as an opportunity to weaken its Cold War rival, pumped billions of dollars into training and arming the Afghan Mujahideen, Islamic fighters, through Operation Cyclone. Among the Mujahideen groups was Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda, which received weapons and funding. The Soviets withdrew in 1989, but Afghanistan was left in civil war, with warlords and radical Islamist groups fighting for control. Unintended consequence. The U.S. helped create a generation of battle-hardened Islamic extremists, some of whom later turned against the U.S. After the 9/11 attacks carried out by al-Qaeda, the U.S. demanded the Taliban, which ruled Afghanistan since 1996, to hand over Osama bin Laden. The Taliban refused, leading to October 2001. The U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom, quickly toppling the Taliban. With the Taliban gone, the U.S. installed a new Afghan government under Hamid Karzai and later Ashraf Ghani. The U.S. aimed to turn Afghanistan into a democracy while eliminating al-Qaeda and Taliban insurgents. The problem? Instead of leaving after removing the Taliban, the U.S. stayed, trying to rebuild Afghanistan with no clear exit plan. For 2 decades, the U.S. attempted to build a stable Afghan government, but several major problems emerged. Corruption and incompetence. Billions of dollars were spent on building an Afghan army, infrastructure, and institutions, but much of it was stolen by corrupt officials and warlords. The Afghan government became heavily reliant on U.S. aid and failed to govern effectively outside of major cities like Kabul. Afghan soldiers often sold U.S. weapons to the Taliban or refused to fight, knowing that the government was weak. The Taliban regroups. By 2006, the Taliban had regrouped in Pakistan and launched an insurgency using guerrilla tactics, IEDs, and suicide bombings. The U.S. responded by sending more troops and launching drone strikes, but the war turned into a costly stalemate. The shift to Iraq, 2003 to 2011. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, shifting resources and attention away from Afghanistan. This allowed the Taliban to gain more territory, turning rural areas into no-go zones for U.S. troops. The problem? The U.S. was fighting an unwinnable war against an enemy that could hide in mountains in neighboring Pakistan while waiting for the U.S. to leave. By 2020, the U.S. had spent $2.3 trillion, lost over 2,400 American lives, and trained a 300,000-strong Afghan army, but the Taliban still controlled large parts of the country. The Doha Agreement, 2020. The Trump administration negotiated a deal with the Taliban in Doha, Qatar, agreeing to withdraw U.S. troops by May 2021 in exchange for Taliban promises not to harbor terrorists. The Afghan government was not included in these negotiations, undermining its authority. The Taliban's lightning advance, 2021. When Biden took office, he delayed the withdrawal to August 2021, but the Taliban had already begun taking over cities. August 15, 2021. The Taliban entered Kabul without resistance, as the Afghan army collapsed within weeks. Despite 20 years of U.S. training and funding, the Afghan president Ashraf Ghani fled the country, abandoning his government. The disaster at Kabul airport. Tens of thousands of Afghans rushed to Kabul airport, desperately trying to escape. Scenes of chaos included people clinging to departing U.S. planes, a suicide bombing by ISIS-K killing 170 Afghans and 13 U.S. troops, and a failed U.S. drone strike that mistakenly killed civilians. The last U.S. troops left on August 30, 2021, officially ending America's longest war, but leaving Afghanistan in Taliban hands once again. The problem? The withdrawal was poorly planned, leaving behind Afghan allies, weapons, and equipment. A. Humanitarian and economic crisis. Afghanistan's economy collapsed, with millions facing starvation. Foreign aid was cut, and U.S. froze $7 billion in Afghan assets, worsening the crisis. B. Women's rights erased the Taliban, banned girls from secondary education, forced strict dress codes, and restricted women's jobs and movement. C. Terrorism concerns remain. The Taliban promised to not harbor terrorists, but in July 2022, a U.S. drone strike killed al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri, proving al-Qaeda still had safe haven in Afghanistan. The rise of ISIS-K, a rival terrorist group, has led to more violence. Bottom line, after 20 years, trillions of dollars, and thousands of lives lost. The U.S. left Afghanistan in the same hands it sought to remove in 2001, the Taliban. 1. Lack of a clear goal. After removing the Taliban in 2001, the U.S. had no long-term strategy for Afghanistan. 2. Corruption and dependency. Billions of U.S. dollars went to corrupt officials, while the Afghan army relied too much on U.S. troops and air support. 3. The Taliban's resilience. The Taliban hid in Pakistan, waited for U.S. troops to leave, and knew they could eventually outlast America. 4th, rushed withdrawal. The poorly executed U.S. exit left thousands of Afghan allies stranded, causing international embarrassment. Was the war worth it? Many argue the U.S. had no choice but to leave, but the way it left damaged America's credibility. The return of the Taliban and Afghanistan's collapse remain a symbol of failed U.S. foreign policy. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe to show your support.